My name is Daniel Perel. I am very pleased to be with you this morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. For me, it's morning. I'm happy to welcome you to this first of three so-called expert dialogues hosted by the Coalition for the UN We Need in advance of a series of roundtables called for by the President of the General Assembly on the Secretary General's Our Common Agenda report. There's a lot of actors here. My name is Daniel Perel, and alongside Maria Fernanda Espinosa, I serve as a co-chair of the Coalition for the UN We Need. So let me first outline a couple of the goals of these three dialogues, and then I'll provide a little context, and then we'll dive right in. So in his letter of December 23rd, 2021, the President of the General Assembly chose 68 paragraphs outlining key recommendations from among the 90 plus made in the OCA report for further review by member states. This is the Secretary General's Our Common Agenda report. There are 5 PGA roundtables taking place over the next month or so, and there are 3 of these expert dialogues. And if you're curious how 5 turned into 3, it's because a few of the roundtables occur on a Thursday, Friday, Monday, Tuesday, meaning we either had to meet on the weekend in between or just do a 2-for-1 kind of deal, and we chose the 2-for-1 route. So this is the first of these 3, and this one and the final one would be of 2 hours duration, 1 hour for each of the 2 roundtables taking place. So I have the pleasure of moderating this first hour, and Maria Fernanda will take over for the second hour. And we'll begin with 2 speakers per session to speak for about 10 minutes each, followed by a 30-minute interactive discussion. So what are we talking about, and how are we approaching this dialogue? So the goals of what we're trying to do is to develop a host of possible ideas and approaches that could become a civil society contribution to the roundtables. We're aware that there is space in the afternoon of the second day of each of these roundtables, but perhaps it's helpful for us to coalesce a little bit in this space. So, and the first of these roundtables is taking place on Thursday and Friday of this week. So while we're looking to advance a process of coalescing, again, around these OCA-related proposals, processes, and outcomes, we're really still at the stage of a nebula, which means all kinds of ideas are drifting about and all of them are most welcome. Hopefully, as the more gravitationally strong ideas gain momentum, we can form, to slightly mix metaphors, a lovely constellation of ideas. In other words, this is a space for creativity and out-of-the-box thinking, which means we can forgive each other for ideas that may not be feasible at this stage in order to perhaps generate other ideas that could be. So in that spirit, an active chat box, active participation is really not only welcome, but vital for us to find which ideas have the greatest gravitational pull. So finally, before diving in, let me provide just a bit of the broader context. So in his remarks before the General Assembly just last month, outlining his priorities for 2022, the Secretary General identified 3 crises in need of better global governance. And it's important that he put all of this in the context of global governance. The climate emergency, COVID-19 pandemic, and as he called it, a morally bankrupt financial system. He raised the alarm on 5 urgent needs for global governance on COVID-19, global finance, climate action, lawlessness in cyberspace, and peace and security. So this is a lot of responsibility on the shoulders of global governance. and he concluded that his report on Our Common Agenda, which strengthens Agenda 2030 and the SDGs, that it offers a roadmap to gather the world together to address these governance challenges and reinvigorate multilateralism for the 21st century. So in all of these dialogues, we'll be focusing on 3 questions, 3 guiding questions, and this can be found in the materials that you received. The first is identifying priorities. So which of the OCA proposals should be further developed? How should they be sequenced in order to accelerate the achievement of the 2030 Agenda and Paris? The second is what's missing. So what particular global governance proposals aren't mentioned in the OCA report? And even what things are you cautious of, I might say, in terms of how the report is constructed or the approach is being articulated. And then there's next steps. So what are the immediate and medium-term next steps that need to be taken by global civil society and governments, the UN Secretariat, to best prepare for the proposed summits and the action that will hopefully build on that. So with that all as prelude, and I apologize there was so much, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our first speaker on accelerating and scaling up the SDGs, leaving no one behind. Ms. Agustina Briano. She's the Outreach and Development Coordinator for Club de Madrid, who's joining us from Spain. And after her, we will have Midar Yusuf, who I'll introduce once Agustina has finished her contribution. So thank you so much, Agustina, for joining us. You have the floor for about 10 minutes. Good luck.
Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you for the Coalition for the UN for inviting me to represent the Club of Madrid at this meeting. As mentioned, my name is Agustina Briano, and I'm the Outreach and Development Coordinator for the Club de Madrid. And it's my pleasure to be sharing with you today a bit of what the Club de Madrid is doing in relation to all this and what we see as our main priority and how we are going about it. The Club de Madrid has been accompanying the OCA reports, and I'll be focusing on Cluster 1 and specifically our recommendation on a World Social Summit by 2025 that the Club de Madrid presented to the Secretary General back in October 2020, later in February 2021, and that we're so happy to have seen reflected in his report. Before I dwell in, though, just a couple of lines on the Club de Madrid for those of you who don't know us, so that you can put all this in context of who we are. The Club de Madrid is the largest forum of former democratic heads of states and government who share their expertise and experience for the promotion of democratic values and democratic practice around the globe by identifying recommendations for the strengthening of public policy to lead to more peaceful, sustainable, and inclusive societies. So within that mission, we have a working program on multilateralism and global governance, which has a specific line on reinvigorating the United Nations to make it fit for purpose to the challenges of the 21st century. And as such, Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations and founding member of the Club de Madrid, invited us to share input first towards the UN 75 process, later towards our common agenda report. And we're now going to be active participants of the consultations of the President of the General Assembly, and we are firmly committed to continue supporting the process of the implementation of the OCA as we go forward. So within this star recommendation of the Club de Madrid in the OCA process, I mean, we have others, and I'm sure our reports to the Secretary General on the OCA has been shared, but I will be focusing the presentation on four key areas, which I think can shed light on the focus of the exchange as explained by Dan. First is why the Club de Madrid has been now advocating for a World Social Summit by 2025. Secondly is what we envisage that such a summit should accomplish. Thirdly, the thematic priorities that we think it should address. And lastly, some reflections on implementation. So why has the Club de Madrid been advocating for a World Social Summit by 2025? Well, basically as a reinforcement for Agenda 2030. We feel our members, when I say we, that's members of the Club de Madrid, more than 107 former heads of state and government from over 70 countries, feel that Agenda 2030 was already losing steam before the pandemic hit. The pandemic then has put national states around the globe to the test in delivering social services. This has caused serious disruptions in the delivery of basic social services. It has caused an increase in socio-economic tensions, which has led to increasing polarization and nationalisms at a time when the challenges we face are more transnational than ever. Just as a reflection, data that we have collected reflect that COVID has set back Agenda 2030 and the SDGs by 5 years. This has increased inequality in access to social services and has particularly increased the vulnerability of women, youth, and minority groups. All this at a time when, in fact, the world's richest have continued to see their wealth increase, and in some cases skyrocket, as has been illustrated in Oxfam's latest reports on global inequality, which is excellent, and I strongly recommend it. Just some data to show how COVID has affected the SDGs. For 119 to 124 million people have been pushed into poverty. There has been disruption in essential health services in 90% of countries. 86% of primary school children in developing countries have been deprived of education, and 32.7 million children are at risk of never returning to school. 400 million jobs have been lost. There has been a 60% income reduction for informal workers, and 4 billion people have had to cope without access to social protection. So this is all breathtaking. And we feel that if we want to achieve the SDGs, accelerate the implementation, scale them up, we really need to take stock of what has happened with COVID, both in terms of challenges and the lessons learned. Another factor is the pace of digitalization, which is breathtaking, and digitalization is now part of basically all political discussions. Digitalization can serve as a catalyst to attain the SDGs, but if the digital gap is not addressed, it can serve as another factor that increases social inequalities. So basically, if we want to accelerate the implementation of the SDGs, if we want to stop backtracking in the agenda of development, and if we want to prevent socioeconomic tensions from resulting in further political turmoil, we really feel that it's time to act now in the social front. So based on this background, what should the summit accomplish? Well, in our view, there's three basic aims. One is support the UN in accelerating the SDGs. Two, support the UN in fulfilling its commitment to build back better. And three, help us all in building more resilient and fair societies. To do so, we feel that the summit should focus on solutions and deliver on the four following fronts. First, it should deliver in driving a reinvigorated approach to accelerate and scale up the SDGs. It should put in place mechanisms for the innovative mechanisms for the design, financing, and implementation of new social policies and programs that can focus in giving access to basic social services. It should help national governments as they hone their own programs for post-COVID recovery, always with the idea of also reinforcing resilience in the face of future emergencies and crises, because there will be more and of different natures, including the climate crisis, and launching new alliances and partnerships to make this effort sustainable, not only in the financing, but also in the short term, medium, and long term. What priorities should the summit tackle, content-wise? We believe the World Social Summit should be held under the broader umbrella of leaving no one behind, with key priorities such as inclusion, equity, and access at its core. This has led us to consider different core elements such as human dignity, decent work. The concept of social sustainability has been shared by our president, Danilo Turk. And ultimately, what we want to talk about and put at the center is rights and jobs as a core of the World Social Summit in terms of substance, and with importance, as we were mentioning before, of always paying particular attention to women, youth, and minorities. So under this broader umbrella of rights and jobs, there are four main thematic areas that have been coming out in our discussions and in our work. And obviously here, this is work in progress. We're accompanying the UN, so we also have to see which issues come out as a priority for them. Even though we do feel that civil society shouldn't be straitjacketed by the efforts of the United Nations, and that beyond the issues that they identify, which we feel we should accompany, we should also look beyond in order to continue mobilizing the agenda and highlighting, as been mentioned, issues that may be missing. So those areas for us that should be a focus are decent work. It is important to promote formal work and to maybe shift mindsets from the concept and measurement of economic growth and aggregate growth to job creation and the quality of jobs. And I echo, as mentioned before, Oxfam's report on wealth creation in a time where social inequality has increased so much. Secondly, universal safety nets to secure access to basic rights such as health, education, housing, or even pensions that are essential elements of human security. Large regions of the world count on staggering percentages of informal employment, which automatically leaves millions of people without a right to social security networks. In Latin America, for example, 40% of the population has no access to social security, and in Afghanistan, only 10% of the population has access. The different measures that should be explored, from reserving percentages of national budgets for this purpose, to creating global funds to support least developed countries, to decoupling social protection from employment status altogether. Then we have the issue of equity that we feel is fundamental to ensure equal playing fields, that there should be greater policy coherence and cooperation at the global level on these policies. And this also has led us to consider the architecture of the global financial institutions and their mandate, which is an issue that the Club de Madrid has also been working on quite a lot on inclusive economies. In times of austerity, debt crisis, and decreasing development aid flows, it is hard to envisage where financing for all this can come from. So the Club de Madrid has been calling on the international financial institutions to include human rights to their mandates to ensure the effects of the policies is properly considered. So given all this, what do we see as next steps for implementation? Well, we basically have 4 parallel lines that we're working on. Firstly, is to continue supporting the intergovernmental process of the United Nations by supporting the Office of the Secretary General, the President of the General Assembly, as I was mentioning, in consultation processes, will be involved in this first consultation through the participation of Danilo Tur, but we hope to also be able to participate in others, particularly related to the Digital Compact, which is cluster number 3, or cluster number 5 on a high-level advisory board. We will we will also evidently support the lead agencies that are given the responsibility of following up on this, be it UNDESA, the ILO, and other UN commissions and committees. We're very committed to mobilizing member states so as to muster political will and identify champions for the World Social Summit. We're very eager to engage the private sector in the conversation because we feel that it will be a fundamental actor in all this, not only because they have to be engaged because of the discussion per se, but also for the issue of sustainability and financing. And we are very committed to leading the space in civil society. We plan to very possibly hold our policy dialogue 2023 on this issue, because as I say, the time is now. We need to start putting timelines. We need to start thinking of input, and we want to galvanize that process of civil society to ensure that in 2023, there's a clear input that can then be fed into the UN process and the summit by 2025. And here also as a reflection, just to say that we feel that this priority is so important that even if it falls through the UN process, we feel that civil society needs to step up and organize a summit on the World Social Summit anyway. So it can be a civil society World Summit for sustainable development, if you wish. But we're very committed, and we look forward to working with the coalition for the UN we need and other partners around the table as we take this forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Agustina. There's really a lot there, and there's a lot more to be said. And I'm hopeful that others will contribute, ask questions, raise a few ideas. Just to start some juices flowing, I had a couple of thoughts arise as you were speaking, and maybe I'll just throw them out there. So as Nidara is speaking, we can kind of ruminate on a number of things. One is this focus that the Secretary General placed on the social contract and what kind of role this summit could play in renewing that social contract. The second one, similarly, is his focus on moving beyond GDP. I think that this may be able to play a role in that, and how might we approach it. And then the third is actually, as today is the start of the Commission for Social Development, what role for that commission in a future United Nations. As we all are all aware, the World Social Summit in 1995 spawned the current iteration of the Commission for Social Development, and this would be a renewal of that summit. Doesn't mean a renewal of that commission. So sorry for all those words, and you're going to have to pause and not jump in with answers just yet. Because I would like to pass the floor on to Nidara Yusuf, who's the Global Governance Innovation Network facilitator. She has all kinds of wonderful titles, which I just lost in my my little run of show. She also is the youth representative for the C4UN. I can't remember exactly the title that we gave you. I'm so sorry, Nidara. Oh yes, here we go. Global Youth Coordinator. See, even better. See, there it is. So Nidara, you have the floor. Sorry for taking your time.
No problem. Thank you so much, Dan. And thank you as well, Agustina, for really setting up the conversation and providing all this context. I'll quickly touch on two things because I also want to go into this discussion ahead of us. So the first thing I'll talk to is some outcomes of a recent e-consultation that's been taking place with regards to the Global Governance Innovation Network and the Global Policy Dialogue in partnership with a lot of organizations that are currently on this call, and specifically speak to the first discussion question that you gave us, Dan, of some priorities that kind of stand out with regards to the OCA report. And second, I'm going to touch a little bit on youth as a big part of the UN agenda, leaving no one behind, or LNOB, and accelerating the SDGs. So first, on the outcomes of the e-consultation, we've recently just wrapped up segment 1 of the consultation, which actually addressed the 3 questions that we're discussing here today, and kind of got an initial brainstorm going. So just to feed in what we learned from that into this conversation as well. One thing that largely stood out in terms of what are some priorities going forward was this idea, Agustina, as you mentioned, of a new social contract, where specifically states view themselves as part of a global system, not where a global system provides for states. And this works in tandem with intergovernmental processes. And there were several debates that took place about whether this should converge into one form of governance or whether it's 2 sides of the same coin. And please keep an eye out for an outcome report from this consultation that will dive into that debate in a little bit more detail. But the essence of it was that a crucial first step in being able to tackle other global challenges, like managing the commons, sustainable financing, and vaccine equity, was this cultural shift in the way that we think about global governance and global networks and innovation as a whole, and to start to identify as one big global system, one big social network, as opposed to thinking of kind of individual states that then feed into or utilize the global system for their own needs. And so this kind of initial fundamental cultural shift, supported by this new definition of a networked multilateralism that we hear in the Our Common Agenda report. Again, another contentious issue, again, another place that's open for debate. And I really hope that we do touch on issues like this during this expert call or the series that comes from this. But using these kind of new redefinitions of the multilateral state to catalyze this cultural shift. And also in that sense, seeing the OCA as a manifesto of the UN, because it is a massive menu of options. And so rather than trying to digest it all, some suggested that, so maybe we need to look at this as kind of a value, a normative standard setter going forward, but also suggesting the UN has a role as a convener to bring together this multilateral platform for change. So that's on the outcomes of the consultation, and I'm just putting that out there as food for thought for the discussion ahead. But moving on then to some substantive contributions that I'd like to add to this expert dialogue series. So when we talk about youth, and this is a big kind of area of this thematic cluster, for those of you that saw together the fantastic spreadsheet that Jeff put together, you'll see that several paragraphs in this first theme that the PGA references talk about youth agendas, from youth in politics to the UN Youth Office to the Youth in Government Index to focal points of young people across the board as well. but also things like education, empowerment of young people through employment, and social protection. So a lot of young people's agendas come under this role. And I think there's two things that I want to highlight here. First is that future generations and young people are two separate groups. And so in conversations about youth and future generations, I think we need to keep in mind that we're advocating for future generations and we are advocating with young people. And there's a distinction there. But I also think, and I appreciate that to this end, the PGA has placed these two agendas, although they should kind of in general be mainstreamed into all conversations, in two separate clusters. So there's the Leaving No One Behind cluster that's happening on the 11th of March, but then we have the Future Preparedness cluster, which is happening a little bit later, that talks more about the future envoy and future generations. So just to draw that distinction a little bit. But it's crucially important to work with young people for sustainable systems. And so the reason I think it's important to bring this up as a recommendation, not just in the conversations that I have with my youth networks, but across the board, is because only when we realize in which ways we can successfully engage with young people, but also, you know, successfully receive information that a lot of young people are working on kind of constant research, are we able to create systems that change and evolve with generations, but also take on the needs of the hour. So we get this thing called system knowledge evolution when we're able to work with young people and incorporate them into our ways of thinking, as opposed to siloing them off into a separate conversation. And so with this in mind, in having worked with a wonderful network of young people, from the Young Leaders Council to the Next Generation Fellows, through UN 75 dialogues way back when the UN 75 political declaration took place, but also, as Dan said, my very fancy title of Global Youth Coordinator for Coalition for the UN We Need. In general, three key recommendations came about to operationalize effective engagement of young people and with young people off the back of the Our Common Agenda report. So allow me to quickly run you through just the titles of these three recommendations. So the first is intentionally designing the UN Youth Office with an integration mandate to catalyze cross-fertilization of young people's work in different fields and constituencies. I think we need to be very aware that young people are not one homogenous group and they don't all work on the same agenda all the time. So part of the role that we see of the UN Youth Office, but equally of civil society, is cross-fertilization of these different research agendas, these different advocacy agendas that young people have across the board, from civil society members to NGO members to UN agencies to youth ambassadors, all who work on the same ideas, but in slightly different ways. The second thing is mainstreaming representation of youth in politics and global decision-making through a UN Youth Council. And this would work under the UN Youth Office's mandate. And this is very similar to advocacy proposals we see. For example, the We the People's campaign has a UN parliamentary offer kind of in development and making great progress as well. The idea here is to have young people across the board be a part of a global consultative process and have this be intergenerational, to be able to feed into decision-making processes. And third and finally is increasing transparency and access of mechanisms to engage with young people beyond a privileged few. You'll often find it's the same young people's names that keep coming up in conversation again and again and again. This is because there are only a few people that kind of figured out how to crack the system and weave their way into the conversation. What we need more of is realizing that youth is in fact the majority of the global population at the moment, and it shouldn't just be one or two people representing more than, you know, a significant number of the world population. And so ways that we can do this are by capitalizing on existing communication channels and institutional channels. The SDGs were a great reach because we use schools and universities to reach out to students. And so with similar effects as the Our Common Agenda report, the Paris Agreement, it's about reaching out to people in ways that you already can do so. You know, young people have the capacity to make a single tweet go viral in less than 24 hours. So surely passing on information shouldn't be an issue. But in that sense, this information needs to be translated from technocratic jargon, which even as someone who tries to be as involved in the conversation as possible, you hear the UN 75 Declaration, the OCA, and the Paris Agreement, and the Youth 2030 report, and then there was another Global 2030 report, and then there's a Tech Envoy report, and but really all of these kind of call for the same change. They kind of call for the same goals. So sometimes the role of civil society just becomes translating this technocratic jargon into clear action items that young people can then take on and kind of embrace as part of what they care about in terms of the global agenda. So I'll stop there to say two things. The first is there's stuff out there and we want to engage, and part of that might come from a cultural shift. Please keep an eye out for our report on the consultation. The second thing is that young people are fun to work with, so please do work with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nizara. I couldn't help but grin. I find that young people are more than fun to work with. They're also original and creative and thoughtful and concerned. There are a lot of qualities that youth have that I think are far above that many of us who are sort of hardened by years of, I mean, I'm not that old, but hardened by years of family needs and all of this. So I really appreciate the passion with which you spoke. I do have a question that I would want to turn back to you or to others, as I did with Augustina. And it's this small thing that you said in there, which is finding ways to change and evolve the processes with generations while also responding to the current hour. I think that dichotomy is something that we are really trying to work on. How do you create an institution that seems institutional, but that is flexible and allows for change in the future? That I think is one of the things humanity needs to learn about. So maybe we can ruminate on that a little bit. We'll now open the floor, and I'm so glad that Roberto Vicio has raised his hand because I wanted to call on him anyway. So Roberto, the floor is yours. I look forward to hearing your intervention.
Thank you so much, Danielle. And I'm really happy to have heard from the Club de Madrid about the concern on how can human rights be made mandatory into the activities of international financial institutions, particularly the IMF. Now, the issue that I wanted to raise, I'll try to keep it to the 3 minutes, is in answering to the question that you formulated about what's missing in global governance. And it is a particular aspect that it's becoming very important. As you may be aware, last January 26, a few days ago, 10 former presidents from Latin America and Spain, I suppose that many of them, if not all, are members of the Club de Madrid, demanded that the IMF should take responsibility for having granted a record loan to the government of Mauricio Macri in Argentina of $45 billion to be paid back in a short time, absolutely impossible to comply with, in order to benefit him electorally and to limit the next administrations. Now, think a moment about that. The IMF is taking an issue to benefit a sitting president in its re-election campaign. It's 9 former presidents that say that, knowing very well the situation that they are talking about. This is a serious accusation to an international organization that was also signed by many former foreign ministers and senior legislators. Now, many legal experts have concluded, after an analysis of the standby agreement of the IMF, that substantive rules that enable the IMF's functional competence to provide balance of payment support to its members were violated in a way that is too manifest to be open to reasonable doubt, thereby raising suspicion that this agreement its approval was ultra-virus. Now, ultra-virus has nothing to do with COVID. It's the Latin expression for beyond the powers, meaning the IMF had no power under its articles of agreement to approve such a thing, which is the biggest loan in IMF history. Also, it's not a minor thing. Now, what happens when international organizations act beyond their legal capacity? Now, the acts that are so approved should be invalid and void. Now, the standby agreement did not meet any of its declared objectives. As a result, poverty doubled in Argentina from 20 to 40% of the population, and the country still owes $45 billion to the IMF, risking a default that would have consequences terrible within the country, but also in the whole global financial system. But the IMF has no review body in its governance. There is no Supreme Court. There is no appeal mechanism. So what are the options for the millions of victims whose human rights to health, education, social security have been massively violated by this agreement, not to mention the leave no one behind principle? Now, since the IMF is a member of the United Nations, the UN General Assembly and the International Court of Justice have the authority, and I would say need, to judge the legality of its procedures. But we don't have a precedent on how to assess the damages caused, the unjust enrichment that of the IMF itself, and also how to determine the liability for damages that staff members and officials may have for having provided negligent advice to the executive board regarding the fund's capacity to enter into such agreement. Now, the IMF is saying, this is in its blog of 3 days ago, that they are seeing the largest debt surge in the world since World War II, with global debt rising to $226 trillion, which creates a situation that, according to the IMF itself, now governments must navigate a world of record high public and private debt levels, new virus mutations, and rising inflation. Now, dozens, maybe up to 100 countries might need IMF balance of payment support over the next month. And the risk of new mistakes or blatant illegalities by an organization that lacks proper accountability and appeal mechanisms, they are too high to be ignored. So in the framework of these discussions about governance, the UN General Assembly should ask the International Court of Justice for advice on what are the legal paths for governments and victims to challenge the legality of certain decisions of international organizations when they lack proper review mechanisms themselves, and what are the procedures for remedy and the assessment of losses and damages. And all of this does not require any change in the Charter of the UN, like many of the other proposals to change multilateralism that are floating around would require. It is within the existing Charter of the UN, within the existing mandate of the General Assembly and of the International Court of Justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Roberto. I think this very specific.
I am putting this document on the chat box if anyone wants to see it in detail.
Thank you so much, Roberto. I think this very specific and in fact quite tragic example is really helpful. And I also appreciate the constructive proposal to advance this. And I think this is exactly the kind of thing we're looking for. Now we have 4 people in the queue, and I'm very pleased about that. So I just ask that you keep your interventions timely so that others are able to contribute. So we have Hagar, and then we'll go straight over to Yasmina. So Hagar, it's wonderful to see you again, and you have the floor.
Hello, Danielle. It's very good to meet you, and thank you all for the very powerful interventions. I just have 2 quick points that I would love to discuss more with you. The first point is about the concept of leaving no one behind. So I'm coming from a conflict-prone region where we still do have lots of groups that are left behind. And not only in one goal, but in like the whole 2030 agenda. The SDSN index shows the decreased level of sustainable development that is implemented in Africa and in the Middle East. So my question would be, and this is a question where we can all think about, what can we do more in order to reach those people, those who do not have media internet and they do not show on the TV. What we can do to reach them. And the second question is, how can we involve them more in order to have an equitable and transparent representation for everybody? My very quick second comment is regarding the passionate speech of Nadara, if I'm pronouncing the name right. I support your points a lot, and what I think that we need to work on is that to have a one concrete platform that gathers most of the efforts that is done by youth or for youth. Because as an example, me myself, sometimes I get confused with lots of agreements, lots of interventions, and lots of stuff. So I put my hands together with you to form this, I don't know, sort of coalition or alliance or a platform that gathers all the efforts that is done for youth and to youth. I thank you so much, and I will be following the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hagar. She's joining from Egypt, for those who don't know. She's a wonderful colleague based over there. So Yasmina, straight to you. You have the floor.
Great. Thanks so much, Dan. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. I just wanted to make a few comments on the role of civil society more broadly in the process. I think highlighting something that Nudhara said about the role of civil society organizations in translating technical jargon to have something more digestible for a wider audience. I think that's something that's very important. Right now, I work with the Coalition for the International Criminal Court, just to give an example of a successful civil society network platform that was really instrumental in the creation of the International Criminal Court 25 years ago. And right now the court is also working on a review process to kind of take stock of what needs to be improved. And the role of civil society is also quite key in this process as well. We are a key stakeholder in the process. And I think that it's quite important with this OCA process that we have platforms such as the Coalition for the UN we need in order to elevate the voices of civil society, because civil society is a key stakeholder in this process. And we as civil society are also bringing the voices of the global community to this world stage. So I think it's important to continue translating this information and making it something more digestible and accessible to a wider audience in order to ensure more accessibility and transparency with the process. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Yasmina. I think that point is really important to look at some of the historical examples that have worked well, whether it's the Coalition for the ICC or the banning of landmines. There's a lot of where there's a lot of consensus, civil society can really take some amazing steps forward. And perhaps this is yet another example where we can move forward together. So we'll turn straight to Nobile Moyo, also known as Q. Nobile, you have the floor.
Thank you, Daniel. Good afternoon, colleagues. Good evening, good morning, wherever you may be. I think my intervention maybe a little bit more also is going to lean on, focusing a little bit more on the leave no one behind kind of like perspective in terms of, and also borrowing a lot from Nadura's very impressive presentation. Maybe just to be quick on it, I think when we speak of youth issues, I coordinate the GPAC Youth Peace and Security Working Group, the global one in 15 regions that we work in, and also the African Union Youth for Peace program across the region. So I've had quite a 10 years experience working with young people. And I think I agree with you, Nadura, on some of those challenges. And from a remedy perspective, some of the things that we've seen, when you look at it from a CSO perspective at a global level, what's important also is the fact that, what we need to do, maybe what we need to push more for as CSOs at a global level, even at UN level more specifically, is to leverage sometimes on the existing platforms that are there, because we do have very strong institutions that look at youth issues, but what we need to look at more is in how we harmonize and encourage more collaboration and partnership amongst them, because there's a lot of duplications. Even when you see some of the calls, that are put out there for youth issues. They are more or less the same, but there is no continuity or partnership across the globe. Yet the issues, when you look at them, they are all virtually the same. Whether you want to go to the Americas, you want to go to Africa, you want to go to Europe, usually they are more or less the same kind of challenges. So when you look at it at a continental level, you've got the AU, you've got the AU youth envoys, you've got the UN youth envoys, and even at regional level, when the regional blocks, they also have seats of young people within the RECs themselves, the regional organizations themselves. At national level, you've got the ministries of youth, you've got the youth policies. At community level, then you've got those institutions that you're talking about, the universities, the faith-based organizations, the youth institutions at community level. What we need to do now is to find a way meticulously of following up from the bottom up. How do we link those young people, even specifically at community level, most specifically also looking at even from the third world side of issues, because they are usually left out because of sometimes when you look at the requirements, let's say even for funding for CSOs, some will tell you that they need audits, 3-year audits, and offices. And sometimes you're talking of youth institutions that are maybe even operating from under a tree, but very organized in dealing with real day-to-day issues in conflict spaces. And automatically that leaves them out because they do not qualify for some of the fundings that these institutions are giving out globally. So we need to find a way of not leaving them behind. Also is how then also, these are some of the issues that we need to be practical about to see how is this funding being distributed? Who is getting this funding and how is it getting to the people that really need it? Because I'll guarantee you, you will find that 3/4 of those funding are going to the very same institutions, as you mentioned, that it's always the same faces. 3/4 of those funds globally are going to those very same institutions. And, it's only going, I'm sorry, I meant to say 1/4 of those youth institutions. 3/4 are left out because they don't get those fundings. They get a little bit of dribs and drabs. So we need to find out, we need to look at a bit more on how are we inclusive, firstly from the funding side of issues, because once they get funding, then they can participate at a broader global platform and also have their voices heard. Secondly, then maybe in wrapping up, then I think then we need to look at it from the normative frameworks that we have as far as youth, peace, and security issues. We've got the 2030, the 1325s for the young girls and women. Is how are they being implemented at national level? Do we have youth policies? Do we have youth representation at government level to enable their voices to be heard? How are we funneling that from building it from the ground up, leading to how then they coordinate or work with the envoys, whether we want to say at UN level, at AU level, at EU level. I think if we do that, whether it needs to constitute a global research on this specific topic, which I think is key because it affects even the peace and security issues at global level. With some of these conflicts, it's mainly young people that are not happy about being excluded. So it'll, I think, to some extent, maybe address half the challenges we have in terms of peace and security as CSOs if we can invest in that. Thank you so much. I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There are two elements I just wish to highlight from what Q just mentioned. One is this idea of the hierarchy of knowledge. I think we have to move past, that you have to have been educated in these hallowed halls all over the world in order to contribute effectively. I think we can move past that now to recognizing the brilliance of the grassroots experience. And then the second is this idea of an international enabling environment reaching down to the grassroots, and then the voices of the grassroots reaching back up and creating this sort of cycle of learning from both. And how we encourage that to happen means that the new patterns need to form, and that's not super easy. And hopefully that's what we can discuss now. So we have Muzna next. Forgive me for mispronouncing your name, and then followed by Ugratna. So Muzna, you have the floor. We can't hear you, unfortunately, though you're unmuted. We'll give you a moment to try and switch the microphones. Can't hear you yet. One more shot, and then we'll turn to Ugratna while you find a solution. So give it another chance, Muzna. Okay, she says 1 moment, so let's turn over to Ugratna, and then we'll come back. Ugratna, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Daniel and everybody else. I won't take long, just a very short comment, and it's wonderful also to see some of our previous colleagues that we have worked with here as well in the meeting. I'm Yugratna from India, and I'm one of the 2 elected focal points of the Children and Youth Major Group of UNEP. And we are extremely delighted to contribute to this conversation, and also excellent presentation by the youth lead of the coalition, and I would congratulate her for the great work and analysis that was provided. Just to specify that the young people, I mean, are organizing in different forms and shapes, right? So specifically looking at this year, Children and Youth Major Group alongside the Swedish Youth Council is coordinating engagement for Stockholm Plus 50 in the form of a Stockholm Plus 50 Youth Task Force, and which would be, of course, moving into June, but then also certain follow-up activities. There's also a set of youth organizations in Latin America that are planning the Rio Plus 30 Youth Forum in July at the moment. Of course, we are waiting for guidance from member states as to about the formal convening of Rio Plus 30 itself. And I just wanted to extend invitation that as the major group, we are committed to working with all young people and youth organizations, and of course, everybody else that wants to support young people and to engage in this conversation as well, depending on how and where, you know, thematic or substantive or central inputs as such might be needed. And also to highlight that specifically in the Youth Task Force of Stockholm Plus 50, there are some trainings and consultations planned, which are also funded by certain member states on meaningful youth engagement, and certain youth groups that had worked in the youth recommendations for our common agenda in the name of our future agenda are also involved in those discussions. So, and equally, we would be, you know, again, happy to work with everybody interested and bring everybody else into the conversation. And I just wanted to also specify that as for what are the substantive positions on the UN Youth Office and the various proposals, at the moment we do not have a position as a constituency. As you can imagine, these are very, very broad and important topics to take a specific position on. At the same time, we are committed to dialogue with all youth organizations and networks in order to build on what could be a collective position for this, respecting, you know, principles and barriers of meaningful youth engagement on these topics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yugratna. And I just want to point out that there is currently a UNEP Global Stakeholders meeting ongoing right now. It's a 4-day session, and Yugratna has decided to join us for this morning. So or this evening for her. So I'm very grateful, Yugratna, that you've come, and best of luck in those sessions, which I was listening to in the hour before this one. So all the best to you. Muzna, would you like to give it another shot? Oh no, we cannot hear you yet, but we saw that you said, okay. I think she'll probably try to put it in the chat box, or maybe there'll be another shot. So it is currently 3 minutes before the top of the hour, unless you're in India, which is on the half hour, as I like to point out. So what we'll do is we'll turn briefly back to the original, kickoff speakers for their thoughts and reflections on what has been said thus far. So we will turn first, of course, to Agustina. You have the floor for your responses. Good luck.
Thank you, Dan. Well, I'll try to go in order. The comments that came on the side of the social contract and World Social Summit part, because many have focused on the youth component, which is incredibly important as well. On your questions, Dan, we are at those different levels that I mentioned. We're ready to engage with all kind of actors. I mean, the Club de Madrid's DNA is very much based in multi-stakeholder approaches and to engage with partners to maximize synergies and impact. So we are already in discussions with the Commission on Social Development and others. So as I say, the more actors that we can bring into the discussion in this effort of mobilizing civil society and mobilizing political will towards the World Social Summit, the better. We close no doors. The more bridges we can build, the better, as I say. Moving beyond GDP is an issue that you brought up, and that's definitely something we're thinking about. It's been on the agenda for a while, as we all know, and we definitely think it should be part of a World Social Summit to make sure that we are getting the full picture in terms of social equity, and that we are thinking of concepts that are not there and that reflect social inclusion or not, right? As we were saying, the number of jobs and equity distribution, the environments, there are lots of factors that should be included there. Even, you know, there's a World Happiness Index as well, which brings also a very interesting perspective into all this and the quality of life. So definitely. On the issue of the IMF, the International Financial Institutions in Argentina, the Club de Madrid didn't participate in that letter, wasn't led by the Club de Madrid. I'm sure that there are members in common that probably signed up. Maybe it was IDEA, which is more focused in the region. But we have called out to international financial institutions. We did so in the case of Nicaragua very recently, because they continue to receive public international funds from international financial institutions, despite the terrible assault to democracy that we have seen by Daniel Ortega. We've also been calling out to international financial institutions, and very much led by Gordon Brown, our member from the UK, on responses to COVID. So we have called out, but not on that issue. And I do take note on the importance of putting those specific aspects that I think Roberto brought up on the agenda. There was an issue of how to reach out to areas in the world that may have less connection, and to populations that may not be connected. This is one of the issues of concern for us when we talk about digitalization and the digital gap. Obviously, it has positive things, but it can also increase inequalities of access, inequalities of information. So we think that there's a lot to be done in promoting the positive aspects of digitalization to make sure everyone is connected and can be active part of society and enjoy social services in this sense. And that's why we also think that the conversations and the engagement towards these summits needs to be at different levels: the local, national, the regional, and the global, to ensure that different actors with different levels of engagement can be brought into the conversation. And in terms of what I think it was Jasmina who was saying about civil society, we completely share her perspective in ensuring that civil society is a strong voice, and we look forward to continue working with Coalition for the UN and We Need, as well as a global governance initiative towards the future World Summit and others. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Agustina. We will turn straight to Nudara for her closing reflections until the next hour begins. Nudara?
Thank you, Dan. And you know, the economics nerd in me kind of just wants to engage straight with what Agustina was saying, but I'll refrain and keep this in mind for a conversation to come. And just quickly engage, Dan, with the initial question you posed, keeping in mind the fantastic remarks that a lot of our participants have shared as well about grassroots engagement and kind of clear mechanisms for engagement as well. So you mentioned this dichotomy between institutions versus evolutionary mechanisms. And I think the key, and I think this is kind of what the OCA agenda is, our common agenda is trying to say, but doesn't explicitly say, is that there is a difference between stable institutions and rigid institutions. And I think that kind of understanding that is key to moving forward. And in fact, a stable institution will have evolutionary mechanisms built into its structure and allow it to evolve as it is designed. Take a democracy, for example, its strength and stability comes in its flexibility. So I don't think that a stable institution is necessarily a rigid institution. In fact, I'd argue that it's almost the exact opposite. Any institution has to have the ability to evolve with the hour and with the time that it provides. So even in designing things like the high-level advisory board, in designing things like the UN Youth Office, the biennial summit, the whatever other institutional reform is proposed by the OCA, but also by civil society beyond the OCA, I think we need to very critically and carefully think about the evolutionary mechanisms we build into the institution to avoid another 25 years down the line going, oh gosh, what have we done? This doesn't work anymore. And I'll stop there.
Brilliant, Nudara. I think that distinction between rigid and stable is really important. And if we can hold that in our minds as we take these next steps towards what I hope is a stable global governance order that is able to be flexible, I think we'll be in good stead. So without taking more time from the next hour, I have the pleasure of passing the floor over to Maria Fernanda Espinosa, who will moderate the next session. And thank you so much, everyone, for those valuable contributions. Maria Fernanda, the floor is yours.